Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Warren Hoge, IPI's Senior Adviser for External Relations, and I'm happy to welcome you to this Distinguished Authors Series event featuring Stephen A. Cook, author of False Dawn, Protest, Democracy, and Violence in the New Middle East. 5 years ago, when IPI was devoting much of its research and conducting lots of meetings and conversations and events, all trying to understand what was behind the so-called Arab Spring uprising sweeping the Middle East and North Africa, we had a remarkable 31-year-old Egyptian civil engineer named Ahmed Maher come to speak here. It was November of 2011, 11 months after the initial incident that set off the spreading uprisings, when a vegetable vendor in a rural Tunisian town set himself on fire. And it was 10 months after the ensuing protest in Egypt that memorably brought tens of thousands of people into Tahrir Square in Cairo and just electrified the world. Ahmed Maher was the co-founder of the April 6th youth movement that mobilized much of that protest and introduced a lot of us to the power of social media to spur activism around an animating idea. He was an inspiring figure, and it was easy to believe in the promise that he represented. It was a heady time for the pro-democracy protesters in the region and those of us who cheered them on from afar. Ahmed was a little late arriving here that day, but we weren't annoyed or anxious about that when we found out the reason why he was late. On the way up here from downtown, this 31-year-old Egyptian civil engineer who had led protests in Cairo bumped into an Occupy Wall Street movement, and he simply grabbed a bullhorn and joined in. That was the spirit of that time. It was a, it was a hopeful time and a time of great exuberance, so full of possibilities for the people at what had long been the worst governed part of the world. People who in centuries past had established grand civilizations, then witnessed them deteriorate, and now suddenly saw a chance to escape the despotic rule that characterized modern Arab societies and to lay claim to long-denied freedoms and opportunities and maybe even lost glory. And we in the West and the international community and here at IPI were absolutely galvanized by this. Sadly, the next time we saw Ahmed Maher, 2 years later, was a photograph of him in a cage in a Cairo courtroom. He had been arrested for having violated a law against mass demonstrations and was accused of defaming Egypt abroad. He was to end up serving a 3-year jail term, much of it in solitary confinement, and just came out of prison this year, though he still remains under judicial supervision, and Stephen just told me he has to report to the police station every day.
Every night at 6 p.m. and spend the night there.
Okay. This was this young heroic boy who was here in 2011. Now, I begin us off tonight with this disheartening story because it is an emblem of what this book is about. How was it, Stephen asks, that the promise of reform and progressive change never came to pass? What are the consequences of this failure? And how will the thwarted dreams of democracy likely shape the patterns of politics in the region and America's role in it? In seeking to answer those questions, the book focuses particularly on Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Turkey. Stephen is a widely traveled expert in the region, and he speaks both Arabic and Turkish. The book is a penetrating analysis of what happened back then and why, and this is a case where hindsight is really valuable in understanding why we didn't get it back then. In that connection, let me mention the books are for sale at the door, and I will make sure we wrap up here in plenty of time to let Stephen sign purchase copies and also to give him a chance to chat with some of you. In those moments of enthusiasm back then, surrounding the sudden explosion of people power in the Middle East and the wide-eyed belief in the power of street protests, a lot of writers, editors, government officials, and analysts expected either explicitly or implicitly that transitions to democracy would follow. From my reading of the book, Stephen includes himself among those who were swayed by this over-romanticized vision of what could be. And there are a lot of references in the book to, quote, Bigfoot journalists, unquote, and almost all of them seem to come from my old alma mater, the New York Times.
Not true, not true. Not all of them.
For myself, I remember well stating somewhat loftily back then that this might be like the historic wave of revolutions across Europe in 1848, forgetting that all those revolutions ended up in failure and produced more repression than had been there before. But I look by that because we were so enthused by what we thought this one was going to be. I also recall a young Egyptian editor listening to me go on in this vein and warning me, don't compare this to Czechoslovakia in 1968, which a lot of us were doing. And of course, Tunisia, which in reality and also in Stephen's book is the most hopeful example of what happened and what still might be. Every time an event would happen there that was encouraging, the writing of a constitution, the creation of a parliament, an election, we would always go to see our cherished and wise Tunisian friend, Youssef Mahmoud, who is here in the second row right now, a policy analyst at IPI. And Youssef would always say to us, be careful, warning us that, don't go this, you may be disappointed in the end. Stephen notes that since the late 19th century, Arabs have been asking, who are we? What kind of government do we want? What is the proper relationship between religion and society? And is Western-style modernity compatible with our values? False Dawn is a bracing account of whether we are any closer to responding to those basic concerns after the convulsive events of the past 5 years. So please join me in welcoming to IPI the author of False Dawn, Stephen Cook.
Well, thank you very, very much, Warren. It is a tremendous pleasure to be here. I greatly appreciate the invitation. It's wonderful to be here at IPI. And this is the kind of event that authors dream about when they're writing their books, to spend an evening with interested and interesting people discussing this work that you've labored over. This book actually took me exactly a year to write, 6 days a week. And it's an awfully lonely experience. So now here's the real payoff. To talk to people about what it's about, for people to ask me questions, to challenge me on some of the things and some of the themes that I raise in the book. And I'm glad that Warren raised the issue of Ahmed Maher, the founder of the April 6th movement, one of the founders of the April 6th movement, and that moment in late 2010 where it began in Tunisia and early 2011. And throughout that year, I could have easily called this book A Tale of Two Tahrir Squares. And I'll tell you why. Not to give away the book, but the prologue of the book is my account of my night on January 25th in Cairo, the first night of the Egyptian uprising, trying to get into Tahrir Square. And then finally getting into the square and experiencing what was happening with, at the time, was a relatively modest size for what transpired over the course of the following 18 days, but about 25,000, 30,000 people in Tahrir Square. How I experienced that, how I view that, it was an incredible, incredible moment. I have been studying the Middle East for quite some time and often wondering, will this kind of thing, I was much younger then, of course, but I lived through the changes in Eastern and Central Europe. Would this kind of thing ever happen in the Middle East? Throughout my academic training, there was always this kind of question, why had the third wave of democratization missed the Arab world. In fact, your alma mater, New York Times, in the 1990s, ran a Sunday piece in what was then called the Week in Review and is now Sunday Review, called Democracy's Desert, about the Middle East, using the metaphor of the desert, the Middle East being a place where democracy has never flourished. And that moment, on January 25th, and I was back in the 26th, although they closed the square that night, I kind of got bumped around by the police, and again on the 27th, was an extraordinary moment. It was an exhilarating moment, and Warren's quite right. I was infected with the romance of the barricades. I let my kind of analyst self, expert self, kind of get carried away, because here were people who weren't that much younger than I was. And I live in this cocoon of the United States. I grew up in, suburban Long Island, New York. I did all the right things. I went to the good schools. I was fortunate that my parents were able to provide for me. And here I am. I have this wonderfully interesting life at the Council on Foreign Relations that affords me the ability to write books about the Middle East. And here were tens of thousands of young Egyptians who had these tremendous hopes of living in a more democratic, open, and just society. I was experiencing this human moment. What could be more human than that, than people coming out collectively demanding their dignity? It was extraordinary. And I think people looking at this, remember back 6 years, how many people were transfixed by Al Jazeera English? Morning, noon, and night, moving from Tunisia to Egypt to Libya to Bahrain to all the countries of the region. And every country in the region, with the exception of Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, experienced some form of social protest. So it really did seem that this was the Arab analog of 1989. It didn't turn out to be that, obviously. There was the Tahrir Square that I was in January 2011. And Warren mentioned that Ahmed Maher was here in November 2011. After Hosni Mubarak fell, I went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth to Egypt. I had just written my previous book called The Struggle for Egypt, and I was fascinated what was going on. And of course, I was preparing to write the epilogue for that book. And I was a regular commuter to Egypt. And I found myself in Cairo for the first post-Hosni Mubarak elections. And on the eve of those elections, I was back in Tahrir Square. But it was hardly the edifying moment that it was 11 months earlier. What I witnessed in mid-December 2011, was the kind of bizarro opposite of the Tahrir Square that I had experienced in January. I witnessed what was called the Battle of the People's Assembly, or sometimes referred to as the Battle of the Cabinet Building, in which Egyptian security forces and Egyptian protesters squared off in basically gang warfare over what no one could actually figure out. This, to me, was a metaphor for uprisings that were clearly going in the wrong direction. And it was that moment, it was kind of the kernel for False Dawn. Why, after these moments of exhilaration, were we experiencing something that looked quite different and far more sinister than everybody had hoped? Of course, the Syrian uprising had already been militarized. Libya was already a country on the brink of civil war. There was Tunisia that seemed to be making great progress, but it hung in the balance. And yes, a lot of the journalism and a lot of the expert analysis on a country like Tunisia was Tunisia, the one Arab Spring success story. And hanging out there across the Mediterranean was Turkey, the country that everybody said was a model for the Arab world. Turkey would be a model for the Arab world. But of course, by the time Arabs rose up to try to take matters into their own hands and build more just, open, and democratic societies, Turkey was already manifesting signs that the great hope of 2003 and 2004, when the Turkish government, an Islamist government, was undertaking reforms that led to an invitation for Turkey to actually begin negotiations to join the European Union, by the time Arabs were rising up against their leaders, the Turkish leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, was already emulating the authoritarian leaders of the Middle East. Maybe Turkey wasn't so much of a model for him, for the Arab world, but the way in which Arab leaders had sought to establish political control over their societies was perhaps a model for Erdogan. More accurately, though, I think when this Turkish party, this Turkish Islamist party, the Justice and Development Party, came to power, they vowed to raise the kind of authoritarian tools that had been used to repress people in their society. The stunning irony of Turkey, even at that moment it was being held out as a model here in the West, was that those same Turkish leaders that had promised to get rid of this authoritarian system were using the very same means to repress people that had been used against them for many, many years. So it's a much, much more complex story, a more interesting and richer story, but a more depressing story. And that is that we have these four cases: Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Turkey, and four different outcomes that none of which kind of match the hope and promise that we all had when we were glued to Al Jazeera English. How many people here actually thought that they would be glued to Al Jazeera English for weeks on end in the early winter of 2011? No. In Egypt, we have resurgent authoritarianism that looks and feels a lot like Mubarak's Egypt, but more repressive. In Turkey, we have a case study in the reversal of liberalizing reforms. In Libya, we have fragmentation of the country. This was after, at that moment, when Gaddafi fled Tripoli, people were saying that actually Libya was one of those countries in the region that may actually have an easier time making a transition to democracy because Gaddafi bequeathed nothing in the way of institutions to the Libyan people. It was a blank slate upon which to build democracies. Oh my God. My Tunisian friends here must be shaking their heads because they know of their neighbor. And actually, one of the most interesting things about Libya was that Muammar Gaddafi's son actually predicted precisely what was going to happen. On February 20th, 2011, he got on television, and everybody remembers his quote saying that they would fight to the last man, woman, and bullet. Thank God he left out child. But he also said in the same television interview, late at night, 5 days after the Libyan uprising began, he said, Libyans, we must settle our differences because we're not Tunisians and we're not Egyptians. We will fight each other for the next 40 years. We will fight each other. We're about 6 years in. We have 34 more years left of fighting in Libya. And I'll tell you, the way things are going, it seems like that's actually a real possibility. We're talking about a failed state. And then, of course, there's Tunisia, everybody's darling. And Tunisia has made great strides, but it is a country on the edge. It is extremist attacks, an economic crisis, more protests away from the reversal of what had been quite hopeful. And in ways, the international community is vested in the success of Tunisia, but has done things that could potentially undermine further success in Tunisia. The whole point of False Dawn is to contextualize and complicate the narratives that had prevailed in 2011. Now, let me quickly tell you a bit about my explanation why things didn't go the way we had hoped. And then I'll end on what Warren talked about, these questions that Arabs have been asking for so long. I'll leave the U.S. policy thing aside for the Q&A, because I know that's on people's minds. Lots of stuff going on in Washington, and the president's actually about to go to the Middle East. So why did it end this way? Why in January 2011 was I kind of overwhelmed with emotion at seeing Egyptians rise up, and then 11 months later, walking away from tear gas that was being fired, shaking my head saying, there's something deeply, deeply wrong here. That led me to ask questions about Libya, where I found, again, the promise had been of democracy had been thwarted, or Turkey, the reversal, and Tunisia, this complicated place. Well, the first thing is, there were no real revolutions in these countries. That's not to suggest that revolutions automatically usher in democratic political systems. But what happened in a place like Egypt was a rebellion that resulted in a leadership change, not a change in the political and social institutions of the country. That had enormous implications for how politics would unfold in the post-Mubarak era. Because if you screw out Hosni Mubarak and you send him to his villa in Sharm el-Sheikh, but the field marshal comes to power, or even in an election, if someone like Mohammed Morsi, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, is elected, Egyptians who want to live in more open and democratic societies have to confront, and did confront, a system that reflected the interests of the old political order, which had no interest. Forces like the military, forces like the intelligence services, forces like the business community, that had really no genuine interest in seeing through a democratic transition. It's similar in a place like Tunisia, where aspects of the old order continued to impinge upon politics and impinged on the progress that Tunisians were making. In Libya, this blank slate wasn't actually a blank slate. There were a whole host of practices and institutions that remained in Libya that contributed to the fragmentation of the country and got in the way and served as an obstacle for a transition to a more decent, just, and dignified political arena. And even in Turkey, where there was no uprising until 2013, there was the Gezi Park protests. I was in that one as well. I probably sucked more tear gas in this room than anybody else. Where, as I said, the new Turkish leadership that came into power, an anti-system party, vowing to undertake reform and to raise the authoritarian institutions of the Turkish state, ended up using those same institutions against the people who wanted a different kind of government. These were the major obstacles. No revolutions, no real fundamental changes to the political orders in these countries, allowing representatives of the old order, or people who didn't want to see a transition to democracy because their interests would be threatened, to manipulate and use these institutions, these rules, these laws, these decrees, to undermine those who wanted to live in more democratic societies. In this very unsettled environment, however, and this is where I get into Warren's questions, or whether my questions at Warren.
Exactly.
People began to confront the failures of their uprisings. People began to confront the stark reality that in the Arab world and in Turkey, they had tried a number of different models. And by 2012, 2013, 2014, we're confronting a series of failures around the region. The failures of the uprisings, the failures of the people like Ahmed Maher to transition from activism to the formal political arena and to present to people a compelling vision for the future. Add to those kinds of troubles in the countries that I'm talking about to a regional environment where Syria had slipped into a civil war, Libya was fragmenting, Yemen was fragmenting, obviously the Iraq project was destabilizing the entire region. And Arabs continuing to ask themselves the questions, who are we? What do we want? What kind of government do we want? What is the relationship between the individual and the state, religion and the state? And in this massive environment of failure, where different models failed to bring people dignity, extremism stepped into the breach. We tend to think of the ISIS phenomenon and the extremism phenomenon as a function of the failure of Iraq or the Syrian civil war. What my research has found, and what I lay out very clearly in False Dawn, is that the failures in places like Egypt, failures in Libya, the massive uncertainty in Tunisia. Go back to Sidi Bouzid today, the place where it all began, and talk to other young fruit sellers. And what do they tell you, as they told me? The only thing that has changed are the names of the streets. Nothing else has changed. And in this environment, the call from Raqqa and Mosul makes sense to people. It's deeply appealing to people. The Arab republics fell, the uprisings fell, the Muslim Brotherhood experiment in governance in Egypt fell. From Raqqa and Mosul, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi says, all of your problems end when you come to the Islamic State and live in accordance with the original community. The fate of Mohammed Bouazizi, this young man who killed himself by setting himself alight in Sidi Bouzid, those problems go away because we all live in accordance with the Quran. And that violence that we recoil, that kind of seemingly nihilistic violence, is part of purifying non-Muslim societies so that everybody can enjoy the equality, the opportunity, the paradise of living within the Islamic State. Now, of course, we know from what we have found in those areas that have been liberated from the Islamic State, that it was the furthest thing from those messages that were being sent from these places, from Raqqa and from Mosul. But nevertheless, to people who are unmoored, disconnected, trying to find their way in an overall regional environment of failure, extremism is appealing to them. I ask in the book, why in Tunisia, the country that seemingly is the one that has made the most progress, has, on a per capita basis, produced more extremists than other countries in the region? And it's because of these failures, because there has been no real change in these countries. Yes, I'm sure people can take me on and say, well, this has changed and that has changed, and point to a whole raft of things that changed. But the overall political systems, the authoritarianism, the lack of opportunity, the lack of dignity, the lack of freedom is all very similar to the days before Mohammed Bouazizi engaged in this act of self-immolation and sacrifice. All very similar to what we find today. Let me end on this one thing. And this may be a good way into spurring people to ask questions about the U.S. aspect of it. If, for American policymakers, the hallmark of the Middle East for the 60 years before December 2010 was authoritarian stability, the hallmark of the Middle East in the coming decades is authoritarian instability. And that's because new leaders, or new old leaders, or newish leaders that have emerged in the region, and here I'm thinking specifically of Abdel Fattah Sisi. He's not Mubarak, but he comes from the same place, so that's why I call him a new, old, newish leader. People like him haven't been able to offer a positive vision of the future for the Egyptian people. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who was just at the White House, rules and governs the 50% of the people who support him and intimidates and coerces the 50% of the people who don't support him. Libya, there is no government. Nobody has emerged. Maybe one will. But that person will need to espouse a positive and appealing vision for the future that makes the most sense to the most Libyans. Otherwise, Libya will continue to fragment. And then there is Tunisia, where there is a strong sense of civic culture, but at the same time, that identity question, Islamism, secularism, what kind of orientation bedevils Tunisian politics to this day. That's very, very similar to what we have seen before. And until leaders emerge that kind of can offer that positive vision, these political systems will continue to be contested. People will continue to see salvation in extremism. And leaders will respond by continuing to use the iron fist to try to maintain political control in these systems. I'll end there. I'm very sorry that I don't have anything to work with to give you a sense of hope. The good news is that there's wine in the back. The other piece of good news is there don't seem to be too many sharp objects in this room. But I will say, even though I can't end on a positive note, a hope for the future, this is an incredibly human story. More people actually live in environments where they're not entirely free and are striving for it. And I think one of the things about False Dawn in complicating the view of the Middle East and contextualizing the view of the Middle East, I think it gives a more realistic understanding of the obstacles to people achieving those hopes and dreams of freedom and dignity. Something that we here take for granted. And certainly, when the uprisings were happening, we sort of, kind of, and I include myself in this, took for granted that these moments of tremendous exhilaration would automatically lead to democracy and dignity and freedom. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
I'm going to have a chat with Stephen for about 8 or 10 minutes here, a couple of questions I have, and then we'll go. I want to hear what's on your mind.
The hard part from the guy from the formerly of the New York Times.
I want to ask you about individual leadership, and I also remember something that happened back in 2011, 2012, here at IPI. We had a gathering one day in this room of young Tunisians, Egyptians, I think Libyans, young people, young activist people from the region. And I said something that turned out to be kind of stupid in the end, but I said, hey, what you all need is a Nelson Mandela. You need a person. And they all said, oh my God, please, because their experience in that world with individual leadership was so terrible that all they heard was, oh, please, not another strong man. I'm remembering that, and I'm looking at Erdogan because of the leaders now who are there, he's the only one who's really a good politician. The other ones are there, and they're there by force. But Erdogan actually, even though it's 50%, 50%, he has popular backing among his own people, which sort of makes him, to me, in a funny way, the most ominous leader there. That's going to fix that society in its authoritarian path right now. Are there any other leaders in the Middle East that we can expect that from?
That is a terrific question. And I do remember that moment where people were talking about moral leadership in the region and who would emerge. Before I answer that about the Arab world, let me talk a little bit about Erdogan, because I am absolutely fascinated by Recep Tayyip Erdogan. This guy is the best politician in the world next to Bill Clinton. And whatever you think about Bill Clinton, he is and continues to be a master politician. And I've been very critical of Erdogan in my writings, and I'm critical of Turkey, what's happened under the Justice and Development Party in the book. But I have this kind of grudging respect for Erdogan because he's such a good politician. He has this kind of innate ability to understand how Turks tick, or at least 50% of the Turks who support him, how they tick. But it's not just that, he's enormously charismatic. This part got cut from the book, but I recount this moment in 2000.
You know I'm an editor. You have to complain about that, right?
No, well,
all writers say that.
Well, it's actually, I cut it myself because it was almost too much. It was too much. But I recounted in a draft of the book a meeting here in New York City with Erdogan in 2005. The late, great Ahmet Ertegun, one of the founders of Atlantic Records, hosted Erdogan for a private dinner. A private dinner for Ahmet Bey was 75 people in his spacious building on the Upper East Side. And Erdogan was there and gave a talk. And I would say probably 3/4 of the crowd were Americans who didn't have any facility for Turkish. And Erdogan I think by now understands more English. I mean,
I was going to ask you, we also, my wife and I went to a dinner with Erdogan back at that same time.
oh, you guys might have been there. You may remember.
I was saying, I bet he does understand English, but
he
hiding
prefers
behind-
to
and
speak
he spoke only Turkish.
Only Turkish. But he was so charismatic, he really moved the Americans who didn't understand it. And of course, he had an interpreter, but he had this story about a kind of Turkish third way. I mean, 2005 wasn't that long after 9/11, and it was just as Iraq was going from horrible to really horrible. And so here was this kind of ray of light from the Arab world, and I was just fascinated how he connected to people.
Can I just know, because I was telling Stephen beforehand, my wife and I took our family to Turkey the last summer we lived in Europe. This would have been 2004. And we rented a boat in the Sea of Marmaris. And every night we would put in at a port. And next to us would be a boat flying the Israeli flag.
Right.
And I remember thinking, this is unbelievable. And yet we were in the middle of a Muslim population and there was no...
And this was this kind of tolerant openness that Erdogan at the time represented. And that's why Turkey is part of my universe of analysis. I'm fascinated also by this reversal of liberalizing reforms that's happened. But Erdogan is different. He's not Zine el Abidine Ben Ali, who was a tin pot dictator. He didn't have a lot of support other than the elites who collaborated with him in stealing from the Tunisian people. But Erdogan has achieved things in his 14 years in office. Better infrastructure, transportation, healthcare for Turks. Erdogan care will not be repealed and replaced. It's wildly popular. And that's what makes Turkey very, very interesting and somewhat different. Now, in terms of who is going to come to the fore in the Arab world, right now, who's on the scenes is not a very inspiring picture. Abdel Fattah Sisi, an artillery and intelligence officer who basically rules the same way that Mubarak ruled, through bribery and the application and threat of force. This is right out of the authoritarian handbook. Maybe his clone in Libya, General Khalifa Haftar, will manage something in Libya, although there's all kinds of different factions and pressures ripping that country apart. And then, of course, in Tunisia, we have two Tunisians here. I always get nervous when Tunisians are in the when they say something wrong. Tunisia has two kind of charismatic leaders in Tunisia. The president, Beji Caid Essebsi, and Rashid Ghannouchi. Well, last time I was in Tunisia, I kept asking people, President Essebsi is what, 90? 91 years old? He goes back to the Bourguiba era. He still wears the Bourguiba like dark sunglasses. It's like the 50s again. And I kept asking people, what happens when he dies? He's not going to live. I don't know what his genes are like. I mean, Hosni Mubarak could live to 125. But I don't know what happens when he dies. What happens when Rashid Ghannouchi dies? Rashid Ghannouchi is controversial, but is, in ways, a charismatic leader as well. He's much younger than Essebsi, but he doesn't look great. Now, some Tunisians would say, maybe it's not a bad thing if both of these men pass from the scene and new blood and new younger leaders will come together. But I don't know. What the secret sauce to Tunisia is right now is political stalemate. Neither of the two major actors can impose their will on the other. Now, in some environments, that produces democracy, because if you can't impose your will on the person and you want to get stuff done, you may have to compromise. But the people who decide that they're not going to impose their will may die, and someone else may come to. I can't name those charismatic, inspirational, non-strongman leaders. They may very well be out there. We just don't know who they are.
You said we should talk about Washington, and we will. In this community, Stephen, we tend to talk about that amorphous thing called the international community right across the street. So as you've described this sort of downward spiral of all that we hope for and where it has gone, what can the international community go? I mean, this may be a Washington question in the end, but just for the moment, international organizations like the one across the street, multilateral diplomacy, is there any room for that in trying to repair the damage?
It's another good question, Warren, and I use the term international community with some trepidation.
Yeah. So
Well, and also, as you mentioned earlier today, that my boss Richard Haas was here with his book, and he specifically kind of says that the international community is sort of a misnomer for international society.
Richard Haas has made a point both times he's come here to promote his books that he has no use for the United Nations. Anyway, keep going.
It strikes me that there is a place for international organizations and the UN. And think about the importance of the UN Human Development Reports in the Arab world in widening that gap between what Arab leaders were saying to their populations in the early and mid-2000s and the objective reality of what they were saying. So, if you were in Egypt in 2004 and 2005, I actually found myself in this odd situation. I was in Egypt in 2004, and I went to the old ruling party in Egypt. Was called the National Democratic Party. It wasn't national, it wasn't democratic, and it wasn't much of a party, but nevertheless, they had a party conference. And I went. And the big culmination of this event was that Hosni Mubarak would speak at the end as the leader of the NDP. And he came and he gave this whole long speech about the strengthening of democracy and the importance of Egyptian democracy and how they were making, and it was almost as if, you could suspend reality and Egypt was democratic and it was just a matter of strengthening it and deepening it. They were using all of these kinds of terms. And when the UN Human Development Reports on the Arab world came out, they unmasked this nonsense. And in my head, I'm thinking of another word. And it allowed activists a certain amount of political cover to say, hey, the emperor has no clothes. And they did this throughout the region. That was important. I don't know.
Well, that report was really remarkable, composed by Arabs themselves. Right. I mean, it's still remembered 10 years later.
And there were follow-ons to that as well.
I mean, just interrupt you. That was a very special moment.
I think that was very, very important in kind of revealing for people. And it got a lot of press in the United States. Of course, this was the heyday of the Bush administration's freedom agenda. And it got and because of the Bush administration's freedom agenda, something that I talk about in the kind of background of the book, some of these leaders had to position themselves as reformers so that when the Arab press, more daring than people ever gave it credit for, took up this issue, the governments couldn't do anything about it. So that ability to that, and this was an international community, a UN thing, to, as I said, kind of increase that gap between what people were being told and how they were, and validating how people were experiencing us, was incredibly important. What the UN could do now, yes, it's Band-Aids. It's providing as much relief as possible. I don't know. Maybe I don't know enough about the UN to speak authoritatively about it, but this kind of bleeds into what I say about the United States when people say, well, what's the US policy response? Someone asked the question, and I'll get into it.
The way you put it in the book, I could do it this way, and it's a good way to put it. Stephen mentions everywhere you're saying Washington has to get it right. So isn't that a presumptuous thing to say now, given the resources that Washington has?
In fact, the title of Chapter 5 of the book is Getting the Middle East Right. And that's not because I believe that's what Washington should do. It's sort of my snarky take on the discourse in Washington about the Middle East and a kind of mismatch between what's going on in the region and what American foreign policy practitioners, the American foreign policy establishment, which I guess I'm a member of, think that we can accomplish in the Middle East. And it comes from a good place. I think it comes from a good place. I'm a kid of the late Cold War. We saved the world from the Soviet Union. My parents were born during the Second World War and were kind of Kennedy Johnson liberals. And so we kind of the idea of the positive use of American power in the world. And so when a crisis happens in Tunisia or in Egypt, and everybody gets around a conference table and says, what are we going to do and how are we going to do it? That comes from a good place. But the mismatch And I use getting the Middle East right because I went to a meeting not long after all of this happened in Washington, and people said, well, now here's a great, Mubarak is gone, Assad may fall, Gaddafi's on the run, we have this new start in Tunisia. Now here's a great opportunity to get the Middle East right. I remember sitting in this room saying, oh, we haven't learned a thing. And we're not going to learn a thing if we continue to have this attitude. Maybe it's a function of the fact that I did have those few days in Tahrir Square at the beginning. But I knew, as a result of that experience, that this had nothing to do with us. Nothing to do with us. I'm sure Ahmed Maher kind of communicated that when he was here, that young Arab activists, this was not their primary concern. There was how they, in fact, it was an afterthought, and they didn't necessarily want American help because they saw Americans as enablers of repressive leaders in the region. So that's one reason why I think, whoa, let's take a step back and understand better what's happening before we jump in and say, well, let's get the Middle East right now. We messed it up for the previous 5 decades. Here's a new start. Let's start doing it again. And when you take that step back and you recognize what's going on, and you recognize and you look at this moment in the region where everything is contested, and you listen to the way people define their struggles, and they define them in existential terms. I remember going and meeting with a member of Nida Tunis, a leading member of Nida Tunis, which is the kind of secularist, Bourguibist, Republican Party, not Republican in our sense, Republican Party in Tunisia. And the way in which this person defined the struggle against Ennahda was truly in existential terms. Listen to what Egyptians who supported Abdel Fattah Sisi and the coup in Egypt in the summer of 2013, and these were millions and millions and millions of people, talking about the struggle for the heart and soul of their country. When people define their domestic struggles in existential terms, it's very, very hard for any external actor to influence the trajectory of politics in those countries. I mean, think about it. Let's take the United States out of the equation. In Egypt in 2013, and since then, the governments of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have supported the new government in Egypt. These are governments that have resources. I mean, we contribute $1.3 billion, maybe $1.5 billion a year to Egypt. They are contributing $25 billion. And their view is, we can only influence the Egyptians on the economic end of things. Politics, no way. So we have to be realistic about what's possible in these places. And my call in the book is kind of radically counterintuitive to everybody sitting around the table and saying, hey, let's get the Middle East right. My argument is, let's understand what's important first and then fashion a policy around that.
By the way, Ahmed Maher, I think you suspect this from what you said about him. Actually, what he did at the Occupy Wall Street movement was to tell them what they were getting right and getting wrong.
Right.
In other words, he was not seeking their support or American support or backing. He was saying, we're smarter about this than you are.
That's right. And I actually had an encounter with him in the spring of 2011, and someone asked him about the United States. First of all, he said the United States should apologize. And he said, well, if the United States wants to continue its assistance to Egypt, it should be as a manner of penance, as making up for what it had done over so many years to enable the authoritarianism of the Egyptian regime.
Reparations, right?
It's a tough guy, Ahmed Maher.
I'd love to get some questions and comments from it. If you just raise your hand, I'll call on you and wait for the microphone to come by.
Don't be shy. I'm not a
I'll
shrinking
start with my
wildfire
colleague
myself.
in the front row, and then Daniele. Do I have a third? And then the third is the, and we'll take 3 questions at once and
Great.
then answer them at the
Terrific.
very end, okay?
So I'm John Hirsch. First of all, thank you very, very much. I thought you were just terrific just now.
Thank you.
I want to ask you, however, about the role of the media in the perceptions of the time. In other words, what you've described right now is this very stark failure of this Arab Spring idea. But in 2011, as I sort of remember it, the bulk of the media, American media, promoted this idea. They heard this in the square, CNN, and all these people, you know, out there, and they promoted it. So I remember Ahmed Maher right in this room, because I was here, So nobody was going to get up who was not in Egypt and say, you're wrong. I mean, he was the only person in the room who was there. So nobody was going to get up and challenge him. So I'm wondering what your own thought is about the extent to which the West has gotten it wrong, based in part on perceptions that were promoted by the media, which was, you know, the day after tomorrow, there's an election in Iran again. And I remember vividly a couple of years ago, one or another journalist, media person saying, you know, the liberals are going to win. That kind, I remember it vividly. You know, they can't go on with the Revolutionary Guard and so on. It was completely wrong again. So I wonder if you could comment a little bit more
Sure.
on that.
I'd be happy to.
Okay, Professor.
Thanks. I'm Dr. Danieli. I want to ask a question that it relates more to the cognitive aspect of it than to the particulars. Because yes, you rightly said that revolution doesn't create democracy. Rebellion doesn't create democracy. It creates rebellion, and whatever happens next is up to the people. But again and again, what I hear, and including in Washington today, that the struggle is between a unidimensional right and a complex sense of democracy. I mean, one of my teachers wrote a book by Escape from Freedom. Democracy is a complex, difficult concept. It takes time to build. It takes time to think of the world not as you or I, but you and I. And perhaps part of the problem is simplicity, either you or I, or complexity and lack of understanding of the process that needs to happen. And we see it in Washington today. We don't need to go to the Arab world.
And we have an ambassador here. Please. Oh, yeah, here, Arian.
Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Warren, and thank you, Mr. Cooper, for...
I'm going to ask you to identify yourself just so the room knows.
Okay,
Thank you.
I'm a Deputy Permanent Representative of Tunisia and New York here. And I'm spending my 2 last months in New York with regret, leaving New York with regret, much regret. So I thank you very much for your book, and we will read it with great interest. Let me say one thing. You started your also presentation by quoting the example of Eastern European countries when they started their revolution in the early 90s. I think that the main motto of these revolutions at that time was strictly stick to the conversion to market economy. That was something that worked very well in the... And I didn't see myself, I was also following very closely the revolution of the Eastern European states. We saw that there was no ideology, contrary to what happened in the Arab world in 2011. I think that there was an ideology, and this is political Islam. I say by that, I wanted to mean by that political Islam, which is definitely a main challenge now for the societies in the Arab world. But let me turn to specifically to Tunisia. I think I wouldn't say that the Tunisian experience is a failure. It's true that Tunisia faces so many tremendous challenges in every aspect and in every field. But I think the great strides that Tunisia achieved in terms of democratization, free speech. If you ask anyone in the street and you tell him, are you able to say whatever you want in the street or on Facebook or on any other media, they will tell you that no one will prevent me from saying anything. And this is a very big achievement in Tunisia. I don't think that writing now on Facebook, though in the time of Ben Ali, you couldn't even say or write any word, but now you can criticize the government, you can criticize the President of the Republic, You can talk of his age, you can talk of anything you want, and you will never face after 10 or 15 minutes how to say it, the big challenge of seeing policemen knocking at your door or security agents from the Ministry of Interior coming and knocking at your door. I think the expectations of the population is so high, it is true, but with the limited resources, we cannot get everything at the same time or within a short time frame. Second thing is that we need the international community to be more and more involved in Tunisia for helping Tunisia. We still need that. Elements of the old regime. I think that in that case, most of the population is aware that there is also very important elements of the old regime, because we cannot wipe out the old regime. These are also parts of Tunisia, and we are talking about reconciliation. So we cannot really say this man is of the old regime, so put him in like what happened in Iraq, for example, or in other places. So I think that the elements of the old regime, and there are many of them, who are very worth involving them in the current situation in Tunisia, in the current process of putting Tunisia in the track. So, the population is people in Tunisia are very aware that among these elements of the old regime, there are many, because Ben Ali it's true that we can criticize Ben Ali on his, but at least we cannot criticize Ben Ali in one angle. He was a very big meneur d'hommes. I mean, he was definitely choosing and selecting his own ministers carefully, and really putting the right men in the right place. And these people, we cannot really exclude them. Mm-hmm. And also I wanted to finish with the role of women. The role of women in the entire world, but the role of women in Tunisia specifically. I think that if really I can sleep quietly at night, it's because I'm quite sure that there are women defending Tunisia against extremism, against any tendency of reversing the situation towards extremism or whatever whatever the extremist elements want to do in Tunisia. And thank you very much. Thank you,
Ambassador.
Thank you.
You want to take those three?
Yeah, I'll take those three. And let me start. Let me go in backwards order.
Sure.
What was so appealing to me about working on these 4 cases in the book, Turkey, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt, was that I had 4 countries with totally different outcomes. They were not the same. And what I say about Tunisia is not that it's a failure, but that it's neither a failure nor a success. And then I go on and tell my reader this complicated, not complicated to read, but a complicated contextualized story about Tunisia, in which I talk about this well-developed civic culture that has pulled Tunisia back from the brink, even though there were tendencies pushing Tunisia in that direction in 2013, and the role of women and the civil code, which is really a central piece of Tunisian politics. The point that I'm trying to make in Tunisia is that it doesn't help anybody to call Tunisia the one Arab Spring success story. It one-dimensionalizes Tunisia, and it doesn't tell the story in an accurate way. As I said, Tunisia is neither a failure nor is it a success, but it is a disaster away from being a failure. It is a great moment away from firmly being put on a democratic trajectory. I don't think anybody objectively looking at Tunisia right now can say that it is firmly on the trajectory of democracy. And that's what makes Tunisia so interesting. For me, I'm not Tunisian. I love Tunisia. Tunisia is a wonderful, beautiful place with great people. But it's a much more complex thing than what we're often told. And that gets to the second question about complexity versus kind of a simplicity. I think that nuance and complexity is hard in Washington. I'm not, this isn't a criticism of policymakers. They have a short timeline, 2 years, 6 years, or 4 years, or 8 years if they're lucky. Although many, 2 years turns into 36 years. But they have a short timeline. They look, policymakers and elected officials look at the world in different, how can I prevent this from becoming a crisis? How can I manage this crisis? What am I getting for my money? And that leads to the idea that we should accommodate ourselves to authoritarian leaders as long as they help us achieve our goals in the region. And after the failures of the Arab uprisings, after the failure of the experiment in the Muslim Brotherhood, experiment with the Muslim Brotherhood's governance, after the emergence of the Islamic State, although the Islamic State's been around since the late 1990s, just under a number of different names, there is a focus on security and what these strong men, no strong women yet, although women are much stronger than men. That's where our policy is going. And then to this question of the media. I hope you buy the book. That's not pressure, but I hope you buy the book. Because in the first chapter, I go through this, I don't know, would you call it long? And this is what rankled Warren, because it's a testament to the quality of the New York Times and the commitment of the people who run the New York Times to having first-rate international coverage that some of his former colleagues come up and think, and I didn't really mean to pick on Nicholas Kristof, but he gave me so much material. Anyway, I was grappling with how we got it wrong, including myself. And so I went back and I read 35 years of commentary, scholarly articles, and books. I started with 2011, and I worked my way all the way back to try to get for myself, book writing for me is kind of a problem-solving exercise. I'm so happy that I get to share it with all of you. Trying to figure out at what junctures and where and why we got things wrong. And I'll give you an example. When I finished my PhD, one of the kind of dominant research programs in comparative politics, and for people who are like me interested in the Middle East, was this idea of authoritarian stability. Why are countries in the Middle East seemingly impervious to democratic change? Within a few months of the uprisings and Mubarak falling and everything happening, people said, well, that research program is dead. It proved to be wrong. Was it? Maybe it wasn't. And so I come to the conclusion that, like my own experience in Tahrir Square, I got carried away with events. It was exciting to be in Tahrir Square. It was exciting for all of these journalists who parachuted in to see that Eastern Europe of 1989 could be transposed to the Arab world. And that's not losing our faculties. It was a rather exhilarating moment. And what I come to is that for all that we know about the Middle East, and we know so much, that it's hard to insulate ourselves from those news cycles. And that if we kept our minds about us when these things were happening and looked at the long term in a broader historical and political way, we actually probably could get things right because we do know so much. But it was my searching way of trying to figure out, including myself. I felt like here I'm an expert, but I was expecting something completely different. How did I get it wrong?
Stephen, in the book, you used a small phrase, short phrase, to say what Washington ought to do. You basically say, think small. How do we do that? I'll say how we Americans do that.
Right.
And but in that you're also saying what we should not do. You mean no more democracy promotion, that kind of thing?
It's part of my kind of radical intellectual project in this was to say we should do less. I mean, how many people work in a think tank in Washington, D.C. and say we should do less? There's always, if you read think tank reports from Washington, there's always a long executive summary with Washington should, Washington must. It would be great if the United States did X, Y, and Z, and on and on. And my view is, and I'm pivoting off of what I see happening in the region in terms of these existential struggles that are going on and the way in which people are defining those existential struggles. And it seems to me that in this context in particular, broad, ambitious, international projects of social engineering are going to make things worse or bring us a lot more grief down the road, because these are things, whether it was the Iraq Project or the Freedom Agenda had some discrete achievements, but not enough in terms, I think, of the time and investment. And from my perspective, I think we do need to think small. I think we need to think what's important. And what's important for the United States in the Middle East is what has always been important for the United States. And look, I think we should have a national conversation about what our core interests are in the Middle East, but successive administrations have determined what it is. And the American people seem to support those things. And those three core things that we care about are assuring the free flow of energy resources out of the region, helping to ensure Israeli security, and making sure no one country dominates the region other than the United States, which is sort of derivative of the first two.
And counterterrorism.
Well, and then add, you took words right out of my mouth. Then we have to add counterterrorism and non-proliferation as well. It's around that we need to focus in this moment while people in the Middle East are figuring it out for themselves. Because this really is a moment of where if the uprisings were a moment of Arab empowerment, it should be a signal to us that we really don't have the resources or the insight to help Arabs manage their politics, and they don't want us to. Now, I would say, I'll give you a little personal anecdote. Way back in 2008, I wrote a piece for, it was Newsweek, I think, and it was called Egypt's Pyramid Scheme. And what it was, it really didn't have much to do with Egypt, but I was focusing on the fact that we had...
Good headline.
Yeah, it was a great headline. Whoever the headline writers are, I mean, you know, they're worth every penny they're paid. What I was focused in on was the fact that U.S. Agency for International Development and a lot of our other development efforts, the funding for that had been reprogrammed to things like holding good governance conferences with Egyptian governors. Now, anybody who knows anything about Egyptian politics, Egyptian governors are retired military officers or police generals who are there for one reason only. And it's not good governance in the sense that we think of good governance, right? And so they were doing conferences, very expensive kind of conferences to kind of teach these guys good governance. And it's nice to hang out at the, Four Seasons Nile Plaza for a couple of days and, have contractors from USAID talk to you and so on and so forth. But we were taking money away from things like rural agricultural programs that had been enormously successful. And I wrote this piece, maybe we should rethink this. Maybe we should continue to devote resources to rural agricultural projects or women's health, to literacy, to education. Those are things that aren't sexy, but over a longer period of time, healthier, wealthier, better educated people may in fact demand their rights. And that may be something that over a generation will contribute more to changing the quality of politics in the region.
You'll have to wait for that to happen.
But, and I was attacked for suggesting this. It was as if I killed puppies. But of course, it's perfectly consistent with a lot of the work on democratization that had been done in the second part of the 20th century. And I think we should start thinking more in those terms than in democratization programs, while the UN continues to do the work that it does in these areas.
The president is sort of cooperating with you by not having named a single assistant secretary of state yet.
And the one who's the acting
not a
just
deputy
announced that he's
secretary.
retiring.
And, anyway, Stephen, thank you very, very much. I'm going to keep him here to sign books that are for sale back there, and the bar is open still. I'm going to get him a glass of wine as well. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you all very, very much. I appreciate your time.